All right. Hi. Hi. Good to see you all from this perspective. Usually I just see the back of your head, so if I don't recognize you from the front, it's because I'm not seeing the bald spots, right? So, my name is Shawn, and I get the privilege to share with you a bit of my journey tonight and to talk a little bit about how I came to know Jesus and how I got here tonight. And within that, I'm going to share a scripture that has been important to me and how I'm living it out now. But first, I want to thank Pastor Dale for inviting me here this evening, and thank you. This is a real honor and a privilege to be able to do this tonight. Some of you maybe know, I'll just start out this little bit of background. I was brought up in a Christian home about a half an hour from here. I'm the oldest of 4 kids. I'm married to Julie. I also have 3 sons and a daughter that you've maybe seen around here once in a while. I was raised attending a Mennonite church that my grandfather pastored for 40 years. Does anybody know what a Mennonite is? Some of you? Yeah? Well, for those of you who don't, there's a couple things about Mennonites. They came out of the Reformation just like the Lutherans did. They were named after their founder just like the Lutherans. The couple of things about them is they're pacifist, which means that they believe in that vengeance is for God alone and that man should not kill. So they don't go to war. If you saw the movie Hacksaw Ridge, it's very much that mentality. They're community-based, not communes, but very close-knit groups. So you don't see them straying very far from home, traditionally. They're humanitarian, which they believe that humans are to be cared for. And so if you're hurting, you want a Mennonite friend. They really take good care of people that way. And they're very conservative, which means change is very hard for them. And in fact, they just avoid it. And there are a lot of times that in my lifetime, I've seen Mennonite churches split over really simple things, but they don't want to disagree about anything. So instead of disagreeing, they just break into groups and do different things. And you kind of think Amish without the buggies. They're that kind of conservative. My group that I was a part of, growing up, was kind of crazy because we were the first teenage group in that church's history that was allowed to attend dances or play the guitar, things that were considered sinful or worldly. And we were not the first teens to engage in teen sex or drink alcohol, and that, so kind of put it all in balance, right? But so who knows the names of the first man and woman in the Bible? Anybody? Yeah. Adam and Eve. Great. Well, they were Mennonite. They were. You know how we know that? Who else stands naked in a garden paradise and is tempted by fruit? So, point made. All right, that was my best attempt at a joke. I have very few in my arsenal, but yeah, so... on a little bit more serious note, I was introduced to porn by a classmate when I was 6 years old, and that really tainted the way that I viewed life, the perspective I had on life, and for many years, and especially the way that I viewed women and sex. And I came to know Jesus just before my 21st birthday, and by that time I'd already consumed a lifetime's worth of alcohol and trying to avoid the pain of living. Have any of you ever been there? Know what that's like? Yeah, a few of you. Yeah. Some of us are maybe still struggling with that more than others, but God almost immediately put me to work when I came to know Jesus. He telling other people about Jesus, and God never wastes anything. He never wastes anything. You sometimes think, I wasted that part of my life. God doesn't waste anything. And in fact, one of my mentors said, anything that you offer to God becomes an offering of praise. If you'll let him have it, if you'll let him take it. And he can turn those things into all kinds of things. But when I became a believer, when I accepted Christ and decided I was going to follow Jesus, God took a lot of that Bible background that I had been given as a kid, and believe me, being raised in the church that your grandfather planted, you get plenty of Bible teaching growing up, but he began to utilize that in the situations that I found myself. And then I also, at the same time, developed my own kind of insatiable appetite for the Word of God as well, and just began to read it a lot. And those first couple of years, I read it many times, cover to cover, just gaining more and more insight into it. And then I went into work in the construction industry because I was making good money there, and I was young, and it fueled the money that I made in the construction industry fueled my ability to begin to do youth ministry and evangelism and preaching. And I worked in prisons and jails in Minnesota for a number of years, doing chaplaincy and traveling ministry with that. So kind of got to see that side of the wall as well. And all of those things were just opportunities to continue to grow into who I've been called to be. And so I want to start tonight by just the question. I guess we passed around a mic here. There we go. That I want to know is... We'll have a couple of people come up again. Oh, perfect. Okay. There's people that are trained to handle these things. Okay. Thank you. Poorly, but... The question I want to ask is just what does it mean to hear God to you? Or here it is. How have you heard God communicate with you in some way? And not everybody's hands at once. There we go.
Hello, everyone. It's working. Hi, I'm Jamie.
Hi, Jamie.
I can't really say that I've heard God communicate with me because He doesn't give it to me that easy. There's things that I pray about. I guess one example, it's been about a month ago, I was, I had a lot of worry and stuff in my heart, and I was praying about it. And on my way to Pelican Rapids, we stop at this Burger King in town, and I look up, and there's this big, neon sign. It says faith over fear. And I'm like, God makes me look for these things. I can't just have it given to me, which, this is probably wrong to say, but that stinks. I wish I could just... I wish He would make it easy for me. But either way, so I've learned to be aware of my surroundings and, to try to be more spiritual when I look at things, because you never know when you're going to find a message from God.
Yeah. Thank you, Jamie.
Hi, I'm Mary.
Hi, Mary.
A lot of times when He talks to me, it's through a thought that He wants me to do something. And it's usually something that I wouldn't necessarily normally do, whether it's help a person, whatever it is. And if I don't pay attention, and I've talked about this in groups before, is if anybody watches the show with Gibbs on it, NCIS, I get a Gibbs slap on the back of my head if I don't pay attention.
Yeah. Thank you, Mary. Any other brave souls? It's scary, isn't it, when you talk about hearing from God? Like, really? What about that guy holding the sign out there? The end is near, God says, right? Yeah.
Oh, I'll stand up and say something.
Awesome.
God has only communicated to me through other people, Scripture, but God has never communicated to me through my speaking. I have to be quiet and listen to hear God.
Thank you, Mark.
My name is Karen.
Hi, Karen.
I'm married to him. But anyway,
I'm sorry.
I'm assuming this was God talking to me. At one point in his ministry, we were looking at moving. And we had a lot of friends that were really against, didn't think we should go. Assuming they thought we should stay, but, didn't think we should go. And at that point, I was working, kind of a normal job, and then I was working, like 3 nights a week in another town 15 miles away or 10 miles away. And one of those nights, driving back from there, I still don't know if it was a voice out loud or a voice in my head, but it was, everything will work out.
Yeah.
So kind of a affirmation that we should go.
Yeah.
So, but I really still think, was it allowed or was it not? So.
Yeah. Yeah, awesome.
I'm Jan.
Hi,
and,
Jan.
God usually talks to me or communicates with me through His Word or bringing to mind His
Yeah.
Word. And a couple years ago, I was in a situation where the job I had was quitting, and it was, everything was, and I'm single, so I don't have someone else to pick up the bills and all that kind of thing. And my biggest concern was my insurance.
Yeah.
And I said, and I found out my Cobra insurance was going to be $700 a month. And I was just in a panic. And I was in my house, and I was getting ready for bed, and I just said, God, I could have handled $400 a month, which is what I thought it was going to be initially.
Yeah.
But I said, $700? I can't handle it. And just like that, the thought came to my head, oh, but I can. It was just like, duh.
Yeah.
He owns the cattle, and he said, I own the cattle on 1,000 hills. I can handle this.
Yeah.
So, and I have to remember that every time when I try and work it. I'm in a situation right now where it's like I'm trying to work everything out to make sure everything's set and all this. And it's just like God's like, I've got this.
Yeah.
I've got this. Relax. So
Thank you, Jan.
that's how it works with me.
We've got maybe time for one more. Is there another? Anybody else want to share? Oh, there we go. Got 2 more. Let's take them.
Hi, I'm Jessica.
Hi, Jessica.
I have heard God, heard Him, someone speaking to you one time, and which I won't get into because it's a long story. But for the most part, I have a hard time hearing God when things get really tough. I tend to roll up my sleeves and I'm struggling, and I get to this really bad place, and people tell me, oh, just give it to God, just give it to God. And I'm praying, what do you want me to do? And then something clicks. It's like when are you going to let me just do it? And I don't know how to do that first. But usually somebody says something. And it could be the same thing that 5 other people told me.
Yeah.
And it just sinks in. I think sometimes you just have to get tired. And this last time, I was so frustrated with people telling me, well, just give it to God. And I was like, I'm praying. He's not doing anything. Yeah. And somebody very smartly said something, which I won't say what it is because you'll get a big head. But he said, you're tired because this isn't your fight to fight. It's his fight. And I don't know why that resonated more than other people have said, or they said the exact same thing, just a different way, but something hit, and I was like, I realized what it was. It's the fear of letting go and not knowing of what's going to happen.
Yeah.
So, and I was like, I just have to fall and just know that in the end it's going to be okay.
Thank you, Jessica. One more.
I think this is kind of a communication, but when I came to believe in God, my behavior started changing a lot. But there was still some things I did that I felt were okay that I never felt bad about. And when I became a Christian, I found that I started feeling guilty about these things that in my head I have no reason to feel guilty about. And I think that was God communicating with me that I don't want you to do these things, Jeremy. So
Yeah. Thank you, Jeremy. Appreciate that. Thank you. Have you ever found yourself doing something over and over again and wishing that you didn't? Yeah, kind of like, stick your finger in an outlet and it hurts and every time you stick your finger in there, you get zapped. Well, eventually God taught me how to live free from sexual bondage. But it took time. And just like learning not to stick my finger in the socket, I had to learn to think differently about women and sex. And I stopped getting burned. When I stopped doing the same things I always did, I didn't have the same reaction I always got. And then he brought along Julie Martin. And we met, we got married, and we started having kids. And, sex is like electricity. It's how, you say, right? How is sex like electricity? Well, it's really awesome when it's experienced in the proper context. That same electricity that burns your finger when you put your finger in the outlet gives us lights and amplified sound and lots of other cool things in the right context. We married, we moved to Nebraska, and we worked with some troubled teenage boys that had been removed from their homes. They actually came and lived with us for a period of time, and we had 19 kids go through our home in 13 months. And, it was very much like a lot of the ministry that happens here, where the mess of life hits reality. And we had 2 little kids during that time, and our family continued to grow, and I ended up kind of burning out in that, and I needed to do something else. And so I got back into industrial construction, and eventually I went to school for ministry and became an ordained minister, and started to kind of move in that direction, but we, at that time, felt very strongly. My wife, actually, I came home. I'd been on the road for, I think, about 3 weeks. And I came home, and there was a for sale sign in the yard of our dream house. I'm thinking, what's going on? And I walked in, and I'm like, what's going on? And my wife said, oh, God told me to put a for sale sign in the yard, so I put a for sale sign in the yard. Okay. That's great. And, about 18 months later, our house sold for cash overnight. But it'd been 18 months. And are you sure God told you to put the sign in the yard, right? But in that time, we shifted gears from thinking that we were going to move to the town where our church was and get involved in that ministry to really praying and saying, God, what is it that you're calling us to do? Where are you leading us to go? And it got to the point where we knew by prayerfully seeking things out and listening to counsel. In fact, let's just take it this way, because Dietrich Bonhoeffer talked about there being a tangible need for silence and solitude to hear God. And then in the next breath, he says, we need to have community because that's where you hear God. So it's kind of this balance between, it's paying attention to both, paying attention directly to God and prayer and in His Word, but also paying attention to what He's saying through the gathering of people around you. And what we begin to learn is that sacred community, or the gathering of called out people like us that are gathered here tonight, sacred community demands that every voice in the conversation be heard, and that God is always speaking, and it's will I give it time to hear what He's saying from all these different perspectives? Can I do that? What if it comes from completely the other side of the fence, right? What does it look like? Well, like I said, 12 years ago, I sold our dream home, and we moved to Fargo. We had been praying for 18 months and about ministry, and we felt like we were called for that. But as we got farther and farther into it, it was like God was calling us specifically to Fargo to reach two specific groups of people: the new Americans and the 20 to 30-year-olds that had been dropped by the church, people who had been raised in the church and no longer attended. And we just had a passion for that. And in the process of moving here, I met a guy who had just planted a church reaching those exact people groups. And then it was like, again, God through the community, you don't need to do the church plant by yourself. You need to come alongside this other person who's already doing it and help them to accomplish what I've put in their heart to do. And so we just moved to Fargo, and I took a job. I was managing a hotel for a couple of years and just doing what it took to pay the bills. But we moved up here, had no home, had no job, had no promise of a home, had no promise of a job. It was crazy, right? And that's what everybody was telling us. You guys have lost your marbles. But we knew, in fact, my wife had a list of 12 things that our new home would need to have. And to kind of put this in perspective, we were leaving a large home on a double lot, and 7 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, tile roof. It was a nice home. It was our dream home. It was what we had envisioned our grandkids coming back to. And we sold that, and we moved up here, and the things on the list were not that. The things on the list were it had to have a window overlooking the area that our kids would play. It had to be within walking distance of the school. These types of things. And we'd spent, our house, like I said, we hadn't had a bite in months. And we finally took a family vacation. We had a family reunion, and we were in Montana. And I mean, rural Montana. It was, my phone rings. It's a cell phone 12 years ago. I mean, you remember those? Flip phone. I'm standing there holding onto a flagpole to get reception. And it's my realtor saying, hey, there's this couple interviewing in town for a job, and they want to look at your house. And we're like, well, we're not there, but we left it clean, so go ahead and show it. And 3 hours later, we had a call from them again. There's an offer for cash. So then let's get in the vehicle, drive 30 minutes to the nearest fax machine, and all of that. And we sell our house, and then all of a sudden, we've got a little 4- and 5-year-old kids that are just bawling because we're homeless. And just this crazy 3-week rush for 3 or 4 days a week for 3 weeks. My wife and I would make the 2,500-mile trip up to Fargo and this area looking for houses and back down. And, nothing ever. And finally, we're like, we got to do something. And we finally found this home in South Fargo, but we had knew that we were supposed to be in North Fargo. But there was we looked at 106 houses in 3 weeks, and 3 of them were in North Fargo. And they were like on Skid Row, and we're like, we've got little kids. We can't have people selling drugs right next door. We can't do that. And we finally look at this house in South Fargo. We come to the signing table, and we're there. It's 3 in the afternoon. We need to sign the papers, get it back on the road by 5 o'clock so we can be home that night because our babysitters needed to be relieved. And we come to the signing table, and for whatever reason, I to this day don't know, but our financing falls through because there's a kitchenette in the basement of this house, and our financing is only good for a single-family dwelling, and they're calling it a double family, a 2-family home. And we're like, what do we do? And we went across the street to this apartment rental place, and we started looking at apartments, and I looked at 3 apartments, and I said, Julia, I have nothing against apartments or the people who live in them. I've been there myself, but I can't see leaving the home that we've been in and putting our kids in a little apartment. They just doesn't work. And she says, well, what are we going to do? I said, we're going to get in the car, we're going to drive to North Fargo, and we're going to find our freaking home. What? And so we started driving around Fargo, and we got lost in North Fargo. And long story short, within 5 hours, we owned another house, and we still live there. And, it was considerably smaller house than we'd left. We moved into a 2-bedroom, 1-bath house with 3 little kids. And in the process of the move, found out we were pregnant with our 4th. And believe me, life gets crazy sometimes. You're like, God, what are you doing to us, right? What have you done? Well, I kind of tangented there. See, that's why I have notes, is because it's supposed to keep me on track. Well, last fall, our family experienced some mess up close. How many of you know that we were created from dirt? Yeah. And when you add a little bit of water to dirt, what do you get? And mud is messy. And our church didn't know how to live with a messy pastor family. And so we needed to leave. And so leaving the church community we'd helped build hurt really bad, and it still does. It's right at the surface sometimes. But we're learning that mistakes don't define us, and we're learning that we define us by how we choose to react. Yeah. So we serve an amazing God who makes amazing things out of dirt and dirty people. But there's a story in my life, a scripture that has kept coming back to me over and over at different points in my life. It came back to me again recently. It's from Matthew 14, verses 22 through 33. And if you wanna go there with me right now, let's see here. It's page. Let me see here. I have it here in my notes somewhere. What page it was in the Bible? Here we go. In the Recovery Bible, it's page 1220, and in a church Bible, it's page 812. But it's Matthew 14, verses 22 through 23. And it says this, Matthew 14, 22 through 23. And I don't have either of those 2 translations myself, so I'm reading this out of the NLT. Hopefully it reads something similar to what you've got in front of you. Immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and cross to the other side of the lake while he sent the people home. After sending them home, he went up into the hills to pray by himself. Night fell while he was there alone. Meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble far away from land, for a strong wind had arisen, and they were fighting heavy waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them walking on the water. When the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified. In their fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost!" But Jesus spoke to them at once. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Take courage, I am here." Then Peter called to him, "Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you walking on the water." "Yes, come," Jesus said. So Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water towards Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified and began to sink. "Save me, Lord," he shouted. Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt me?" And when they had climbed back into the boat, the wind stopped. And then the disciples worshiped him. "You really are the Son of God," they exclaimed. Why did Peter get out of the boat on a dark and stormy night? Faith? He trusted? Trusted what? Trusted God? What? Trusted Jesus? What did Jesus say? Come. Oh my gosh. He said, come. And Peter climbed out of this boat. I mean, think about it. It's dark and stormy night, right? It's the kind of storm that seasoned fishermen, which 6 of these guys presumably were worried about the boat going down. And Peter's going to get out of that? I mean, sometimes we don't realize what's really going on, right? But I want to suggest to you that what Peter is doing here is he heard Jesus in a very Jewish way. And what I mean by that is that the thing that we call the Bible has 2 testaments, the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament is the Jewish Bible. It's called the Tanakh in Hebrew, or in the language that it was written in. But it's But it's this Bible, it's the Tanakh, and it's written in Hebrew, which is the language of the Jewish people. And I started to realize this thing was written by people who thought in a different language than I think in. How many of you know another language? Does anybody know a second language? Are there any of you that English is not your mother tongue? No? Sometimes I meet some native people here and some African people here that they speak other languages, but a few of you know other languages. Things don't always translate real easily, right? From one language to another. Like this. If I say, you drive me up the wall, how do you think that translates into another language? Right? There's a phrase in German that says, du gehst mir auf dem Keks. And du gehst mir auf dem Keks is literally, you go me on the biscuits. What the heck does you go me on the biscuits mean? Right? Well, you see, yeah, what is that? Maybe you're ordering biscuits, yeah. Maybe you've got some gravy and you're just looking for biscuits. But the idea is that these guys that wrote the New Testament wrote it mostly in Greek. And it wasn't their native language. Their native language was Hebrew or Aramaic. And those two languages are not only different languages, but they're different ways of thinking about the world. Hebrew is an Eastern mentality in the way that you think about things, and Greek is a Western mentality in the way that you think about things. And just a quick example of that is the Eastern mentality thinks about life as cylindrical. Like anything that has been done will be done again. Ecclesiastes, right? If it's been done before, it'll come around again. And you literally, you can go to Israel, where the Bible is written, and you can dig down 20 years. You can dig down 200 years. You can keep digging down, and now you're physically standing on the same soil that Jesus stood on. And if you want to dig down another while, you'll get down to where David literally stood, and if you keep going, where Abraham literally stood. So their history is very this way, not this way. But in the Western mindset, we think about time as being very lineal. There's a point A and there's a point B, and there's all these trajectories along the way. But that's two very different ways of looking at things, right? I'm almost out of time here. So, that being said, Peter heard the word come. And just to kind of put that into context, what was Peter thinking in Hebrew that he translates come in Greek? Right? So we understand that. And the word here in the Hebrew is the word Shema. Did you know there's not a word for obedience in the entire biblical Hebrew language? But we read obey, right? Obey your mother and father, right? But it's not actually in the Hebrew. In the Hebrew, there's this word Shema that we almost always see translated here, as in when Jesus is asked, what's the greatest commandment? He quotes from the Hebrew. He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your strength, and your mind. That's how we translate it from the Greek. But that's not an original thought to him. He's quoting back to them that know in Hebrew. He's quoting back to them the prayer, the most important prayer of the Jewish life, which is the Shema. And it starts out literally, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your strength. But the word here is Shema. And so you start to hear that, but then that word Shema doesn't just mean hear like we say hear. It means hear, listen to, and act accordingly. So it brings up this idea that if I have heard God, then I also understand that He has my best in mind, and I'm a fool not to obey Him. So you get to obedience through hearing. But do I listen long enough? So what happens here? Peter hears Jesus say, come, and he knows it's in his best interest to get out of the boat and get out of the stormy sea. And I'm not saying that everybody needs to leave where they've been, They don't need to necessarily go somewhere. But we do need to tune our ear to what God is saying with an intent that we will obey what He tells us to do. And sometimes He asks us to do some crazy things, right? Like, Abraham, take your son, the one that you love, and offer him to me on Mount Moriah. Really? You're going to put your kid on an altar and start him on fire? Seriously? But it's in the best interest for him to do that. Oh my. So, I just say all of that. Has anybody ever walked on water? When it wasn't frozen in Fargo? I mean, when it was wildly active and chaotic? I haven't. I've certainly not done it on a dark and stormy night where it's hard to see the stepping stones, right? But one thing about it is this: getting out of the boat in the middle of the dark and chaos of your life does not guarantee that you will walk on water or that you'll see the wind, and that's for a whole nother discussion. I mean, what, see the wind? Really? It doesn't guarantee that, but not being willing to leave the boat guarantees you will never walk on water, you will never see the wind. It guarantees it. So, in January, we heard Jesus say, "Come," and we got out of the boat that had been our safety, had been our security, and out onto the chaotic, dark waters of, what the heck are you doing for income now? Well, you wouldn't believe it. But we did it. Now you know a little bit about me. My name is Shawn. I came to know Jesus. He taught me how to think differently. My wife's name is Julie. We have 4 kids. Our lives have become dark and stormy last fall. In January, we heard "Come," and we left the boat behind that we helped plant 12 years ago and have started to walk on the water, teaching people how to Shema, to hear, to listen to, and to obey the voice of the Lord through a thing we call Red River Scripture Circles. So remember, some guy met Jesus. Learn to think and act differently. Our situations don't define us. We define us by how we respond. Shema, hear, listen to, and obey. Everyone who learned something tonight, say thanks, Dale. Thanks, Dale.